Welcome to my first ever film review. Let's see how I do. The Tragedy of Macbeth is a new adaptation of Shakespeare's play directed and adapted for the screen by Joel Coen, and as far as I can tell, it features every single line of dialogue from Shakespeare's original Macbeth. The film stars Denzel Washington and Frances McDormand as Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And it's shot in a 4.3 aspect ratio, all in black and white, and this serves the film spectacularly. Its soundtrack is sparse, consisting of drums, cellos, and violins, and I think that's it. And these sounds and bits of music only come up during the few action scenes in the film and during scene transitions. Otherwise, it is entirely dialogue heavy and focused on the lines, on the words, with respect to Shakespeare. And look, I love Macbeth. It is one of my absolute favourite Shakespeare plays. In fact, until I watched and read and performed in Julius Caesar, Macbeth was my favourite for my entire life. So this play has a really big place in my heart, and Joel Coen, through his use of sound and visuals and imagery, really demonstrates an adoration for that play. Speaking of the original play, there's clearly an attempt by Joel Coen to present this as looking like a stage play. What I mean by that is the fact that it's shot in black and white, and it has this 4.3 aspect ratio, and the fact that all of the props, all of the bits of staging, the use of fog, there's a stage-like aspect to it. It is not concerned with convincing the audience that this is a film, that this is something real. It often feels like a stage performance. The cameras barely ever move. They are mostly static, and they rely on the actors moving around within a still frame. And all the props and the scenery and the set, it all looks fake. It all looks like it's stage work. It belongs on a stage, and that again is to the film's advantage. Because it's in black and white and because it looks obviously like it is a stage, it kind of reminded me of old episodes of The Twilight Zone. And speaking of the set, there is a real focus on the surreal. The castle that most of the play is set in, Macbeth's castle, is enormous. It's overly large. It is cavernous. There are long corridors. You never see any ceilings or roofs. It just goes on and on. It's expansive. It feels like a play by Antonin Artaud mixed with a painting by M.C. Escher, and it's gorgeous. And then there's the black and white aspect, which you can read into in a bunch of different ways. For example, Macbeth himself is almost always completely draped in shadow or bathed in too much light, when every other character pretty much is somewhere in between. They're kind of shaded in grey. And you can interpret that however you want to, and I think the choice of black and white allows for different interpretations of what Coen is doing to express his characters. There's also an enormous love for symmetry in this film. Almost every shot is purposely perfectly symmetrical or very specifically off-kilter asymmetrical. There are shots in corridors, forest paths, windows and doorways, or shots of Macbeth on the throne, and all of these are perfectly symmetrical, and it's very pleasing to the eye. And then there are others that are very purposely asymmetrical, sort of like me right now, with one character on one side, maybe draped in shadow, and then there's a lot of light on the other side, and that effect just draws your eye across the screen as you're watching it, and it's just very soothing. There's not a single shot, not a single moment in this film that isn't perfectly choreographed and considered in terms of its visuals and its choreography. And speaking of choreography, there is a rhythm to this. Shakespeare's plays are poetry, but Joel Coen really understands this. He encourages a rhythm to the dialogue. As I said, the music that's in this film only really occurs during scenes where there is no dialogue, and mostly during scene transitions. And even in moments of dialogue, which is obviously most of it, it's a play, there is still a rhythm to it. Music aside, I found myself at one point actually tapping on my leg during one specific scene, tapping along to the dialogue that was being spoken between two characters in conversation. I was tapping like a metronome, because there was this organic rhythm that must have been purpose-built into the film, and it is just spellbinding. As well as the music and the dialogue, there's also a real focus on sound design. In the play, there is a motif, if you like, of knocking. Macbeth says, "Wake Duncan with thy knocking, I would thou wouldst." I think that's the line. Yeah, that's the line. Macbeth is paranoid. Macbeth is afraid. He hears knocking. And the film uses that to its advantage by repeatedly throwing knocking sounds into the film itself. There is knocking on doors, there are heartbeats, there are marching footsteps, there is this constant thudding and thumping throughout the film that really sets you on edge and kind of puts you in Macbeth's headspace. He is paranoid about the knocking, but at the same time he kind of wants them to wake Duncan up in that particular scene, because that would solve all of his problems and then his regrets and his mistakes would be washed away. And Joel Coen really seems to understand that dichotomy between the fear and the paranoia, and also the hope that things will just return and his mistakes will be rectified. And that knocking and that thumping amplifies the paranoia that Macbeth is feeling. These sounds are also incredibly crisp and clean, as is the dialogue. You hear a lot of breaths, you hear a lot of mouth sounds like ASMR. It's very, very intensely focused on voice and sound. And the echoes of the set really amplify this even further. And then there's the acting. Denzel Washington has a lot on his shoulders for this because he's playing Macbeth. I've seen a bunch of different film adaptations of Macbeth. One of my favourites is a BBC adaptation with Patrick Stewart playing Macbeth, and it's set in a sort of World War II, World War I era. I loved Patrick Stewart's Macbeth, of course I did. Denzel Washington, at first, I thought was a little bit wooden. Once he murders Duncan, I'm assuming that this is not a spoiler, I don't think you can spoil a Shakespeare play, but after the murder of Duncan, Washington seems to fall into the role a little bit more. He's able to be a little bit more, I'm going to say caricatured, a little bit more weighted, a little bit more heavy, a little bit more extreme, and that's absolutely in his favour. Frances McDormand as Lady Macbeth, though, I'm not going to say she steals the show because someone else does that, but she absolutely embodies Lady Macbeth in this. There are a few lines that she reads. Now, I've seen Macbeth 100 times. I've been in Macbeth a bunch of times. And there are lines that she delivers that I have never seen them delivered that way, and I wouldn't have delivered them that way, but they work. It makes for a new interpretation of Lady Macbeth to a point, and I think that that's really important. That's the beauty of Shakespeare, is that people often re-deliver lines in new ways and keep these plays fresh, and Frances McDormand really manages to do that. As Lady Macbeth spirals from overconfidence into eventual paranoia and even madness, you believe it. You really believe it through McDormand's performance. She has this uncanny ability to capture your attention, whether she is being boastful and confident and narcissistic and psychopathic, and even when she is being frail and tender and afraid and moments from death. You feel it, you believe it, she is malleable. But it's the witches that steal the show. I haven't mentioned the witches yet. The witches are played by one actor, Catherine Hunter, and she plays a genderless trio of weird sisters. She plays them so incredibly that it would make every actor who has ever played Batman's Joker jealous. She assigns a different voice to each witch, and the cinematography allows her to copy herself. There is a moment where Macbeth and Banquo meet the witches at the very beginning of the film, and there's just one witch standing there, and I immediately thought, well, I know this dialogue, I know how this goes. They repeatedly mention the fact that there are three witches. Banquo says, "Stay, you imperfect speakers." It's a plural, so how are they going to do this? But then suddenly, Catherine Hunter, as the witches, is standing above a pond or a puddle, and there is a reflection of two more witches in the puddle, making three. It's amazingly well done. So the cinematography is on the witch's side, but so is Catherine Hunter. She delivers an astonishing performance as the witches. There is this throaty, gravelly, cockney thing going on. She contorts her body. She is wearing this kind of black chainmail over her head, and then sometimes robes, and she looks like a crow, and there's a lot of raven imagery all the way through the film, not just in terms of the witches, but lots of other stuff, but she almost sounds at times like how a crow would if it spoke. I've never seen a performance like what Catherine Hunter delivers as the witches. This is an Oscar-worthy performance in my opinion. The fact that she's embodying three witches, three voices, three characters makes you think that she is unhinged and strange and broken in some way, but she's obviously not, because she's really doing this. She really can see into the seeds of time, or whatever the line is. She is completely in control and in command, and you do get that sense, you know, the argument that the witches are the reason that all of this happens. Without the witches, would Macbeth have done anything he did? No. So the witches are tied to fate as well, or controlling fate, or both, and it's an interesting argument. And you really get that sense with Catherine Hunter's witches. You get the sense that she is in control and she is relishing this power. And ooh, gives me goosebumps. Joel Coen's Macbeth is a masterpiece of acting, staging, music design, sound design, color coordination, lighting, costume design, set design, everything. There's going to be stuff that I've forgotten to mention here because the film constantly bombarded me with so many details and aspects in terms of its choice of cinematography, choreography, staging, setting, dialogue, music, sound, transitions, everything. I loved so much of it that it's impossible to cover everything. But this is my first film review, so be kind. I really, really adored this. If you're a fan of Shakespeare, if you're a fan of Macbeth, if you're a fan of really gorgeously directed black and white art house films, you need to see The Tragedy of Macbeth. Joel Coen has done something splendid here, and I think this is the now definitive interpretation and film adaptation of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Subscribe for books, and I guess films.